Bloodborne is so cool. And if you need another reminder that your 30s are just around the corner, then get this. Bloodborne released 10 years ago. In the ancient times of the 2010s, Japanese developer FromSoftware was beginning a streak of critical acclaim. Demon's Souls launched on the PS3 to favorable reviews, and its spiritual successor, Dark Souls, was so well received and mainstream that it spawned a whole new genre of games attempting to imitate its tough but fair combat, subtle player-driven storytelling, and often dreary atmosphere. Many companies would see that medieval RPGs like this were the way to go, pumping all their costs into yearly releases until the series is so beaten into the ground that we're hitting stone. Not FromSoft. When they were approached by Japan's studio to develop a game for PlayStation, they decided to do the complete opposite of what everyone was expecting. This was a move that proved to everyone that FromSoftware's success was not due to any trend, gimmick, or luck. It was skill. Bloodborne released to critical, financial, and cultural success, leaving its mark as yet another success in FromSoft's catalog and cementing Bloodborne as one of the few must-play games for the PlayStation 4. In the time since, the game has garnered a cult following, millions of sales, and an equal number of people wanting a port or remaster. This sentiment isn't unfounded. The game is unlike any other FromSoft game ever released, and in my opinion, is undisputably the greatest game they've ever released. That's saying something too, because I love all the Souls games, even you, Dark Souls 2, and yet for every entry I have numerous criticisms, except for Bloodborne, where my personal gripes don't exceed what I can count on one hand. If we expand our scope beyond both FromSoft and Souls-likes, of which there are numerous, we see that no other game presents the same thematic cohesion that Bloodborne does, despite so many attempts from inspired developers. The best non-FromSoft Souls game I've ever played is Lies of P, and the biggest motivator in buying the game was the countless people who said, "It feels like Bloodborne." If that isn't a testament to the game's quality and impact, then I don't know what is. After 10 years, Bloodborne is one of the few games in which I believe it has aged gracefully. On launch, or more accurately on one's first playthrough, the game is a complete mystery. Entire side areas are likely to be missed, the story is not likely to be understood, and the wider themes are so obscured that you need a YouTube channel dedicated to explaining said story to you, the sheer existence of which is proof of its demand and the confusing nature of the plot. After a few years, some lore videos, and endless theorizing on social media, Bloodborne is now, to me, looked at as a mastercraft, with each playthrough offering yet another detail I missed previously, and another layer to the story I hadn't noticed. But what separates Bloodborne from the other Souls games is deeper than a lack of passive defense. It's that no other game has the player's knowledge reflected in its themes. This video intends to chronicle the different ways Bloodborne mirrors the player, and how the player mirrors Beasthood, and why there is, and perhaps never will be, another game like Bloodborne. As I'm sure you're expecting, there will be spoilers ahead. I've received many video requests over the years, but none have come close to the amount of comments I get asking for some kind of FromSoft video, and my response always goes something like this. When it comes to video essays, long-form critiques, hell, even educational lore videos, everything that could be said has been said. These games have been done to death not just by some of the best, but also by some of the worst. Can you guess what category I fell into? My first ever long-form video was on Bloodborne, and it was an attempt to highlight all the things I thought the game did well. While that philosophy of highlighting what I like and don't like never changed, my writing, my production value, and the general structure of my videos has changed significantly since then, which to me warrants another crack at the game. And finally, the first video I made wasn't good and didn't do the game justice, and it's why I've been hesitant to revisit both Bloodborne and any other Souls game, because the main reason that video was a failure to me is that it provided nothing new. I know I have horrendous takes, but I at least try to add something new to the discussion of a game, and if I have nothing new to say, then often I don't make the video. Recently I replayed Bloodborne and began seeing things from a new angle, in a light I hadn't seen them before, so naturally I combed through all the Bloodborne essays I could find that echoed my newfound sentiment and realized no one had discussed it yet, so here we are. Bloodborne is known for two things: its hyper-aggressive gameplay and its lore. But what many essays do is isolate these facets along with other things like world and story, which fail to determine what makes Bloodborne a game that, after a decade, people still want ported to PC. My favorite games are the ones that seamlessly intertwine their narrative themes into the gameplay, and this is deeper than death and rebirth being a canonical effect in the game. It's about blurring the line between our player avatar and us, the player. A great narrative can show us two characters that care about each other, but what games have the potency to achieve is show us a story where we, like our avatar, feel the same way. Throughout this video, I'll explain how Bloodborne achieves this and why no other FromSoft game has been able to do it to the same extent. This is Bloodborne, 10 years later.
Oh, you must be a hunter. And not one from around here either.
Assuming you've played the previous entries, Dark Souls and Demon Souls, then the vibe of Yharnam will be entirely foreign to you. This aligns with our player character, who travels to the mythical town in search of blood ministration, the town's leading means of healing all kinds of ailments. However, this catch-all cure isn't quite what it seems, as it appears those who take the blood run the risk of turning into something. Lurking in the back alleys and decrepit streets are people showing signs of becoming more beast-like. As more and more of these beasts appeared, the townspeople, aided by the assumedly governing healing church, started what the townspeople call the hunt. Anyone brave enough would patrol the streets to eradicate the beast population, and anyone else would lock themselves up inside. No window is without bars, and coffins have layers of chains over top to ensure that whoever is inside remains there, because without them, you're vulnerable. The player, like us, is a foreigner, and we're immediately introduced to a man with a blindfold who can still see. Everything about this opening is uncanny. In a fever dream, we see a beast come crawling out of a pool of blood, but's warded off by these little creatures called messengers, who then consume us, and we're told that someone has found a new hunter, presumably us. Our first introduction is a wolf at half health, feasting on a corpse, and the intended outcome is that new players die. Wolves in this game are hard, and even at half health, when we have nothing to defend ourselves with, it's a fight we're destined to lose unless we make a muppet out of it. We wake to the hunter's dream and just two things: some weapons and some advice from Gehrman, who watches over the dream. He tells us simply to go out there and kill some beasts. Bloodborne, at least initially, has one of the most straightforward goals of any Souls game: just go kill things. It appeals to a player's need for direction while also reinforcing a theme of beasthood and insight. I promise I'll get to the actual analysis soon, but before we do, we need to explain how insight works. Laying the foundation for my analysis is even more important in a game like Bloodborne, because very little of the game is explicitly told to the player. Especially when we get to the later stages of the game, there is a ton of room for interpretation, so it's important that we're on the same page in terms of what certain concepts are before we get into what those concepts mean. Insight, as a mechanic, is your character's grasp on the reality around them. Massive gods hang just over the Yharnamites, but many can't see them. Insight is directly tied to what you've seen in the game, with entering boss arenas and beating bosses granting insight, and they can be lost by spending insight at the dream or having it taken from you. Insight, however, is also reflective of the player's knowledge. It follows that you know more about the game as you got through it, and that your character's insight on the world would do the same. We can think of insight not just as a measure of our understanding of the story, but also of what we can truly see in the game. Many corners, chests, or uninteresting crannies will often carry a madman's knowledge, which if consumed, grants insight. This allows players to find more insight for use in shops, but it also, again, is reflective of how much of the game they have seen. It's a measure of their experience. Someone who has explored more, seen more bosses, checked more secret spots, and explored the game more will have more insight into the game, its mechanics, and story. The player that beelines for the bosses and doesn't care for anything else will have less insight, a looser grasp on how the game works, and will still believe that the story is about some hunter hunting some beasts. Understanding insight is essential to understanding Bloodborne's world design, because not all of it is revealed to us right away. Returning to areas once certain events have occurred, or once we've gained more insight, will show us new enemies, new creatures, and new events. There's an unbelievable amount of detail in every corner of this game, and it's enough to make the PS4 sweat, even when the game is capped at 30 frames per second. There is a large debate in the gaming world between 30 and 60 FPS, especially as the latter has become the new industry standard. The reason so many want the game to come to either the latest generation of consoles or to PC is to run the game at a higher frame rate, and I can't blame them. More frames means a smoother experience, more time to react, and more time to initiate inputs. I do, however, think in Bloodborne's case, and I believe this to be the case for most games locked at 30, is that you can get used to it after a few minutes. For reference, I emulated this game for a few hours to see what 60 frames would look like, and yeah, it looks good, but I didn't find myself enjoying the game that much more. In competitive settings, 60 FPS is preferred, but in a single player game, I think it's fine. All of the footage on screen is captured on the PS5 using backwards compatibility. I was considering recording a playthrough on an emulator where I could scale up to 1440p and run at 60 FPS, but decided against it because 1, the original is still readily available, and 2, there would be a lot more troubleshooting I'd have to go through regarding audio and visual issues. So I want to appreciate the game as is. On top of the excessive detail, you'll see that there are also excessive post-processing effects. The vignette and chromatic aberration is important to making Bloodborne seem otherworldly, as if the whole thing is a dream, and considering one of the endings, for the player, it practically is. The eccentric details are not just there to feed your eyes, but it's here to make Yharnam a place of grandeur and complexity. After all, if beasts were roaming the streets, there must be some reason to want to stay. Sure, a lot of this comes down to Miyazaki's affinity to Lovecraftian horror and the associated architecture, but I think the detail is to convey a sense of presence, as though things are happening. People are currently here, and there's chaos all over. What separates Bloodborne from every other Souls game, even including Elden Ring, is that Bloodborne is the only game where the most important events are happening right now. Dark Souls 1 sees Lordran in ruin, cursed with the undead and falling apart as the first flame fades. Most of the story we read is from item descriptions and characters telling us what happened, not what is happening. Dark Souls 2 is a world with dementia, forgetting itself in its past that is so long ago. It can hardly keep track of where the sky is. Dark Souls 3 is a Lordran that, now in ruins after having the fire linked so many times, is trying to hold on to the different strands of itself, like someone clamoring to put their organs back into a split body, putting parts in the wrong spot and damaging them in the process. Bloodborne is a game where the most significant events of the story are right now. It still has a past and arguably a future, but the world, the characters, and the plot as a whole are undeniably present. Where Bloodborne overlaps with the other Souls games is in how our presence in the world reinforces the themes. In the other Souls games, we are undeniably small, not just physically so, but spiritually. We're one of hundreds of undead, bashing their head against the titans that rule over Lordran, and it's only our miraculous success that makes us the chosen undead. In Bloodborne, the same is true, but the Lovecraftian inspirations make the feeling of being small in a world full of gods more impactful. By the end of most Dark Souls games, you sit atop the food chain, having bested often whoever was there before. But in Bloodborne, there are some gods you still, by the end of the game, cannot comprehend. And our victory isn't marked by sitting atop those we beat, but instead it's marked by joining the next step in human evolution. This feeling gets evoked further and further as you progress because you will continually run into more and more anomalies, horrors constantly out of reach, and more so you will be at the mercy of the Great Ones. Ultimately, Yharnam is a town defined by its presence of larger-than-life deities, beasts, and grand architecture. But even the locations outside of Yharnam get love too. Castle Cainhurst is a complete 180, where instead of Cthulhu-adjacent monsters stalking us, it's ghastly women capable of tearing their own heads off, and gargoyles always situated amongst other statues, to make sure you are always caught off guard. Cainhurst best showcases Bloodborne's ability to keep raising the stakes and variance of the level design. Much of the early game is going to be within Yharnam, a very gothic chaos, but the game quickly shifts from apocalyptic beast hunting to contacting celestial bodies, and eventually communing with gods. Cainhurst is the beginning of that transition, as more things begin twisting and seeming less grounded. Old Yharnam was interesting specifically for how it portrayed the area's boss, the blood-starved beast. The first time we see one, it's when it's hung from the ceiling, postured like a crucifixion, and many players, myself included, probably mumbled, "Huh, glad we don't have to fight that," before being silenced moments later. Areas like the Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Mensis offer incredible views, and the top of Cathedral Ward feel like we are on the cusp of the cosmos, seeing the stars just above like a low-hanging cloud. Setting level design aside, the environmental design here is top-notch, and not topped anywhere else. What Castle Cainhurst also showcases is the cinematography. In FromSoft games, few words are ever spoken, and most of their cutscenes are without dialogue, instead letting the story be told through the environment and through simply showing us what could be prolongedly told. The pure aura shed from Ligarius' frozen bones just oozes sauce, and this goes for most boss openings too. There's literally nothing colder than Gascoigne turning and exhaling visible breath. The One Reborn even has an intro so good that they basically used it beat for beat when introducing the Dancer of the Boreal Valley in Dark Souls 3. In fact, Bloodborne's influence is all over Dark Souls 3. I don't think because the team were intending to disingenuously repeat their past successes, but because for as much as Bloodborne isn't a Souls game, its gameplay represents the next step in the Souls series in more ways than one.
Yharnamites don't share much with outsiders. Normally they wouldn't let you near the place, but the hunt is on tonight.
I won't waste your time with the obvious. Yes, the shields engender passivity, something Bomberman, something boardroom meeting, something Pookie-Loo. I'll try not to repeat what others have said too much, but for the sake of laying my argument's foundation, let's not forget that Bloodborne is far more aggressive than the Souls games have ever been. And when looking at how said aggression affected the series going forward, we can look at the boss design, which, if you'll notice here, has the seeds that, while could be indicative of a gorgeous flower, ended up sprouting more weeds than perfectly made bouquets. The most notable change is the enemy moveset. Most bosses in the first Souls game had singular attacks, and had combos that didn't last more than a few consecutive hits. This made sense in those games because the player moves relatively slower. Sure, not every player hid behind a shield, and unfortunately, as much as it is social suicide, I'll admit that I am a filthy Dex player, often taking a more proactive approach, but Dark Souls was still a game I felt encouraged to play reactively. Fights always felt like a heavy choreographed dance, nearly turn-based. The boss waltzed towards me and my patience rewarded an opening to be exploited, and that created a tango, where punishment was often seen when succumbing to greed, moving when it wasn't your turn, or missing your cue to dodge. But there was one moment where the dance could be interrupted. The equivalent of stepping on your partner's toes mid-dance. The flow, the waltz, all grinded to a halt, in an instance of assertive dominance. A parry is the riskiest move in Dark Souls. With precision needed to perform it on even the lowliest hollow, parrying is the only way to assert yourself over the enemy and dictate the dance. They are left open to a riposte and are at the mercy of your next move. Part of what makes parrying so rewarding is that it's a proactive means of fighting, where you dictate the pace and have control. Control in any game is power, and vice versa, so this can't be given to the player for free. Because parrying takes such an abundance of skill and experience, many players, myself included, didn't even bother. Because missing a parry means damage, or just as often, death. Now, Bloodborne not only takes away shields, but gives you a weapon that's sole purpose, at least in the early game, is to parry the enemy. Later on, you can get guns with more utility, but the first two weapons' focus is on parrying, and this was done to encourage a more aggressive playstyle from the player. Now when we look at being near forced to always have a tool designed to interrupt a boss's attack, and couple it with the bosses themselves that throw endless combos at you, we get a game that is all but begging you to bear some fucking grit and get in there. Bloodborne on my first playthrough took ages. Every boss was its own roadblock, and this was because I didn't bother parrying. I told myself, I know how Souls games work, I just dodge attacks and wait for an opening. But the problem is, that opening is so rarely given to you. If you want to succeed, you need to make an opening. This, more than anything, makes Bloodborne aggressive. The rally system, a mechanic that lets you regain some health if you do damage immediately after losing it, also encourages aggression, but even that health is better regained by simply tanking a hit, but getting the parry off at the same time and performing a visceral attack to get all of your health back. I mentioned that these changes were somewhat detrimental to the future of Souls, and I do agree with that, but doesn't exactly seem like it, does it? Well, I don't think the issue is the bosses having endless combos, but the player having little they can do about it, at least within reasonable expectations. Let's look at the Dancer again, because it has a great example, which is the move they almost always perform after Phase 2. Me and my friend called this the Tantrum, and we called it that because there's simply no point in engaging with the boss in this moment. They swing so much that dodging doesn't give you enough time to retaliate, and the most effective means of dodging is to simply walk away and let her tucker herself out. This issue was mild in Dark Souls 3, but got worse in Elden Ring, and while it's by no means a major issue, I still like both these games. It is turning into a trend that, if taken too far, could draw out the difficulty and length of fights unnecessarily. Now, the obvious answer is to parry, but the games don't incentivize it as much as Bloodborne does, so I don't think it's entirely reasonable to expect players to play in that way. There's a whole discussion to be had about how these changes affect those future games, but it's not entirely related to Bloodborne, so I'll save it. But I want to illustrate a point that the previous games influenced the next, and yeah, obvious, but I believe this is why backstabs were reworked in Bloodborne. In Dark Souls, most of the enemies could be easily defeated by circling them and performing a quick backstab. It hurt the balance, and more tragically, it hurt Dark Souls 2, which in an effort to avoid the same exploits, allowed enemies to turn on a dime, even while mid-attack, leading to bosses that felt as though they had aimbot. This change was poorly received, even if it did, to some extent, work. but Bloodborne presents a smarter solution that doesn't sacrifice the fun in the name of balance. Now, we need to charge a full heavy attack from behind in order to backstab an enemy. This way, backstabs feel good, enemies don't need to reactively avoid it, and because the enemy takes both the damage from the heavy attack and the following backstab, it's even more rewarding. Once again, this new form of backstabbing allows for opportunities to be created by the player, reinforcing the aggressive theme. Now, when it comes to aggression, Bloodborne can be a little on the nose at times. For example, being able to parry and riposte bosses is not that easy, and requires both experience and skill. FromSoft then threw subtlety out the window, tying the damage done with visceral attacks to a stat called skill. This was what I put most of my points into, because I enjoyed the euphoria a successful parry produced, and loved seeing a boss's health bar disappear in the ensuing bloodshed. Some bosses can have entire phases skipped if you play it right with a build like this, but as mentioned, for each successful parry is often triple the amount that you missed and likely died to. I may as well address something I'm sure many are wondering, and that's the use of the threaded cane. Many players think this weapon is bad, especially compared to other choices like the trusty saw cleaver, and yes, that is absolutely correct, but I look way too cool to care. And whatever damage is lost in this weapon due to its lower base stats are made up for when considering the whip's ability to hit most bosses in their vulnerable head, and that it scales in skill, an attribute I would be increasing anyways if I want to keep hitting Alt F4 on a boss's health bar each time I parry. We can see yet another way Bloodborne influenced later games, again in the boss fights, by looking at the sheer size of them. It's important for Bloodborne to have plenty of bosses that tower over the player, because they're meant to be larger than life, at times so large that they are incomprehensible to the average mind. Unfortunately, some of these bosses, no matter the insight, are incomprehensible to the player because we can hardly see them. Bloodborne wants us both to be in the boss's face and yet refuses to zoom the camera out enough to let us see them. This issue is presented from the very first boss, the Cleric Beast. The Cleric Beast is such an excellently designed boss, and yet we're glued to his lower half. Unfortunately for enemies that can't be parried, the best strategy is to stick to their back. In Bloodborne, this is a problem, but not enough to be perceived by players always. Most enemies that are skyscraper sized have telegraphed enough attacks that we can react in time to. The reason I call this a problem here is because it's clear that the future games implementing this same design are getting worse. Think of any dragon fight in Elden Ring. Wouldn't you love if the camera zoomed out a little bit? One of the most praised bosses in all of Bloodborne is Lawrence. And you know why? Because the camera pulls back a little, and you can actually see everything he's doing. This criticism doesn't apply to every boss. In fact, it applies to few of them. But when looking at Bloodborne critically, we can't ignore the few flaws that are here. Now, my footage makes it seem like the calm and calculated approach is what I began with, and that could not be further from the truth. Instead, most players are likely to approach the game from a far more beastly angle. Part of the player progression in Bloodborne is ascending past the inherent beasthood to being more knowledgeable. The build I mentioned before requires knowledge of how parrying works, what different attacks are easier to parry than others, and which bosses can be parried in the first place. This comes with experience, but when I first played, I swung my saw cleaver wildly, praying I could be more aggressive than my opponent, and that after trading 100 blows, I could stumble away victorious. I did this for most of my playthrough, thinking pure strength was enough to win, and that constant dodging was the key to not being hit. And it was. But once I started a second playthrough, I thought it was high time I used that pistol, and it opened my eyes. It wasn't until that third playthrough that I absolutely steamrolled the game. And yet, in doing so, I was much calmer, I dodged less, panicked less, and damaged more. Conveniently, on my first playthrough, I obtained the ending where I woke up the next morning. The second, I fought back, but was eventually paralyzed by the moon presence. On the third, I gained enough insight through the umbilical cords and transcended to a Great One's vessel. The Great Ones are poised as all-knowing beings, and while this is completely anecdotal, it's rather convenient that by the time I knew the game's tricks, how to skillfully dispatch my prey and let go of my beastly instincts to roll and panic when a boss lunges at me, is when my character finally ascended to a higher plane. Part of Bloodborne's player progression, perfectly paralleling the plot, is resisting your inner beast and becoming something more. The beasthood is something that consumes so many throughout the game, turning them into unthinking monsters ravaged by their own instincts and further consumed by blood ministration. While this experience is only my own, I think this progression applies to every kind of player. Strength, Blood Tinge, Ludwig's Holy Sword, or the Chikage. No matter what, you'll go down this path. And while I could talk in depth about the different weapons, builds, and potential solutions to the different problems the game presents, the point is that when looking at the gameplay as a whole, this is what we see. I think it would be redundant to discuss the player's actions any further, as with this being an RPG, discussing it further would serve a discussion for the sake of discussion, when I believe it's more satisfying to look at the different enemies, layouts, and level design. Bloodborne's acts can be comfortably separated between dusk, night, and the cosmos, all divided by a milestone, and represented by the skybox. Dusk sees enemies at their most basic, both in design, attacks, and numbers. Central Yharnam features mostly humans, already being partially consumed by their beasthood, and a few larger golems and wolves. These enemies move slowly, do small amounts of damage, and work to explain some of the basic lessons of early FromSoft games. Weak enemies gain exponential power in numbers. Spacing is important, and check your surroundings. The most challenging foe will be the wolves, as they move fast, hurt a lot, and in this first instance, there are 2 of them. If you have already begun parrying enemies, then the wolf will teach you some lessons about how and when to play around the parry. The first major lesson is that you need to know what attacks are best to parry, such as the ones with a large windup. The other minor lesson is to understand an enemy's combos. The first hit of a combo may come out fast, and might be quickly followed up with a second strike. This second strike would be the one to parry, assuming you are spaced well enough to effortlessly avoid the first hit of the combo. These are lessons you will take with you through the rest of your journey, and they'll be the ones you need to employ over and over if you wish to overcome your beasthood. I've postured a calculated approach as being undeniably correct, and I want to clarify that it's simply where my playstyle and interpretation of the gameplay has led me. There are those that can get away with wildly swinging against bosses, and some bosses like Dark Beast Parl in some ways encourage it with how easily they are staggered, and my neglect to those playstyles isn't a means of invalidating them, it's simply a result of where my experience lies and the lens I'm applying to the game. This won't apply to every playthrough perfectly, and in the case of exploration and how the player engages with the world of Bloodborne, their experience will vary even more. Bloodborne's level design is less interconnected than the Souls games, even being beaten out by games like Dark Souls 2 when we factor in shortcuts, interconnectivity, and general cohesion. We jump into different layers of dreams, get teleported to areas, arrive on horseback, only to see that said horses are decomposing behind us. In spite of this, architecturally, there is a staggering amount of cohesiveness to Yharnam's world, to the point where one could criticize it for not being varied enough, though I'd struggle to agree with that claim. It's not just the player that moves through the world, but the world itself changes, and as the phases of the night progress, so do the inhabitants of Yharnam. Most residents are locked up inside, refusing to open the door for us. Some, however, can be recruited to a hub in Cathedral Ward, coated in a thick incense that wards off beasts. The characters you meet in Yharnam are some of the most interesting in the series because they offer the greatest insight into the world, the lore, and tell their own interesting stories. We can meet these people often at their doors and choose to send them to Yusefka's clinic, where we had awakened upon starting the game, or send them to Cathedral Ward, where an admittedly suspicious person claims he will keep them safe. If sent to Yusefka's, they'll be experimented on, turning into celestial beings, though we won't find that out until much later on. I was able to save just about everyone, except for a little girl I had met in Central Yharnam, who said her father had left the house, and her mother had gone with him. She was worried about them, and said to keep an eye out for her mother who wears a red brooch. We find that red brooch in the Tomb of Odin, presumably being killed by Gascoigne, who turns out to be her father. If we return to her, we can give her the brooch, which will eventually drive her to leave her home too. I initially thought she would make it just fine, but as I looked for her, I found an item belonging to her inside the corpse of another beast. This small side story tells us so much about the hunters, beasts, what they remember, and how the people of Yharnam are progressively driven more and more mad by the Pale Moon's presence. Even the person who tells you of Cathedral Ward, named Gilbert, begins getting more and more sick as the night goes on. He explains that while he was given more time thanks to the blood ministration, he can feel himself changing, and eventually when we return, we find a beast that seems to have broken out of his window, and we're forced to do as hunters do. These moments contextualize a lot of the gameplay at large. Know thy enemy, as they say, and through these interactions we can come to know so much about Yharnam and the beasts we hunt than we would otherwise. Without context, these beasts are simply beasts, but fortunately, even when looking at them as analytically as possible, as nothing more than a challenge to be evaluated, we can still find quality. This is another area where I don't want to tread too far in order to avoid repetition, but it's true, there are shockingly flaws here, like bosses often being too large to properly see, moving at times a bit too fast, and the subject of balance comes into question considerably when we look at the difference between players who do and don't complete side objectives. For the sake of this video, I did a playthrough where I saw just about everything in the game, and by the time I got to the end of the game, I was undeniably overpowered. This is even considering my own form of balance that I would implement, such as at one point only spending souls on Bile so that I had the luxury of not running out, and yet still, bosses like Maria melted before me. I can't decide if the balance should be called into question or if we should simply see this as a reward for poking around. Even thematically, as we get more insight, see more, understand more, mere beasts and fellow hunters are so beneath us that perhaps it's appropriate to decimate them. To go back to vials, this is another criticism with Bloodborne and one I don't have an answer for: the need to farm vials and bullets. Bullets are essential to gameplay because parrying is, so needing to farm for them and blood vials interrupts pacing. One of the early roadblocks I encountered on my first playthrough was the blood-starved beast, and after a few attempts, I would be forced to spend 10 minutes farming wolf enemies for vials before trying again, and all this did was hurt my momentum. We already have a run back, there isn't much more we need. Now, in this particular instance, we can see that the wolves share a lot of similarities to the blood-starved beast in terms of their attacks and how we beat them, baiting out exploitable attacks and sharing aggression, but I would consider this a fluke. What do farming the pigs and shadows before Murgo teach us about Murgo's wet nurse? What do the ghouls outside of Amelia's boss teach us? Nothing in regards to the boss itself. An ideal solution, and one you aren't going to want to hear, is to implement something similar to the life gem system in Dark Souls 2. Instead of collecting blood vials, we can collect something like a life gem, an item that lets us heal slowly over a period, and couple it with blood vials that would be at a reduced fixed number, like 10, that would reset at every lamp or death. I believe this would allow players to still feel rewarded by picking up these hypothetical life gems like they do currently with blood vials, but not feel overly punished for losing. While we're comparing this game to Dark Souls 2, part of what people didn't like about that game was the hollowing system, and a primary reason was because it felt like too harsh of a punishment. If someone loses to a boss 5 times, then it is clearly already challenging enough. We don't need to make it even harder. I think limiting our bullets and blood vials presents a similar issue, where we are overly punished for mistakes. For the sake of transparency, I didn't have to farm any blood vials on my playthrough, but this was my second playthrough in the last year, and was probably my 15th across my life, so it's not exactly a good measure of the average experience. Finally, since this is a Souls game and we're talking about balance and difficulty, let's get the arbitrary discussion out of the way. I do not care if there are items in the game that make the game easier for players. There is some elitism in the community around summons, item buffing, or even certain weapons, and at the end of the day, you're meant to engage with the game in whatever way makes it most fun for you. When my friend played the game for the first time last year, he was becoming so frustrated at having to farm blood vials that I just entered a chalice dungeon, farmed 1,000,000 souls, and then bought an unlimited supply, so he could just keep bashing his head against the wall. I imagine many would say that it's not the intended means of experiencing the game, but the truth is, he enjoyed the game more for it. And for someone like him who's not trying to look at the game critically, why not? I used summons a handful of times when I was stuck. I buffed my weapons, I exploited strategies, because these options are there. That doesn't mean you can't desire that extra challenge, and I give major props to anyone who is capable of beating the game without being hit, but we don't need to dictate how other people play. While we're on this topic, we can bring up PvP invasions. Part of why summoning can be overpowered to some is that you might summon a player that shreds a boss, invalidating the challenge. On the flip side, there are invasions. I cannot stand invasions on a fundamental level. Souls games, Bloodborne included, reward a player's patience, understanding, and skill relative to the world around them. If I am just before a bonfire, 6 figures of blood echoes on me, and someone joins who has clearly built themselves for PvP, is far better at the game than me, and wipes the floor with me, causing me to drop those souls, I don't find anything fun in that. Sure, is it a unique moment? Absolutely, but shitting broken glass would also be a unique moment, but that sure as hell doesn't make it any fun. For that reason, I played nearly the entire game in offline mode. I like keeping to myself and have generally never taken joy in the PvP of any Souls titles. I have experienced each game in online mode on the first playthrough, but I always turn it off on consecutive runs. I don't find it fun, so I don't engage with that entire optional part of the game, and I'm grateful that an offline mode exists for that exact reason. To go back and cast a wide net for a moment, I want to talk about hitboxes, jank, and general glitches, because it is something that FromSoft does so well, and it's something that imitators can never seem to nail to the same extent, and it's consistency. A game that wants to be hard needs to be fair, or else there's no fun. If I have an issue where sometimes my hunter doesn't fire his gun, then the challenge falls apart because it's out of my control. With that said, there are tons of glitches in this game, physics going wild, beasts throwing ass when they die, and plenty of visual blemishes, but I don't hold any of that against the game because when it matters, I never died once to a glitch, took damage because of some inconsistency, or felt that I was cheated outside of one instance, which we will talk about later. I've mentioned before when talking about glitches that I really don't care as long as they don't affect gameplay, and this is one of those cases. To speak on the instance where I did feel cheated, we need to look at the Chalice dungeons, which to start with praise is an excellent idea. A series of randomly generated rooms with different enemies inside all holding loot and blood echoes is an excellent way of introducing replayability and a way to keep the adventure going. But it falls flat because it lacks just about everything that made the base game so fantastic, and features some of the worst design decisions to the point where I would recommend someone on their first playthrough not do them at all. Let's talk about balance first, because the Chalice dungeons were exactly why I was overpowered going into the DLC. I was completing Chalice dungeons and was constantly overleveled, meaning some bosses had entire phases skipped by brute force. It simply seems as though the Chalice dungeons were not considered when scaling the enemy damage and health. If the player wanted to avoid issues with balance and progression, I think these should be avoided. The second reason is because the Chalice dungeons are easily the worst parts of Bloodborne. The strongest part of Bloodborne's visuals is its art style, and that is entirely gone here. Areas look the same, which is expected and not to be entirely criticized, but the visuals of those areas lack the exaggerated architecture and hypnotizing atmosphere that we see above ground. This is especially the case for the Pthumerian chalices, which got repetitive fast. I know this may seem ridiculous, like they're dungeons, of course they won't have the same architecture, but my question is simply, why not? Why make these dungeons? Could they not have more variety? Some of the best areas in Bloodborne are indoors, like Bergenworth, the Unseen Village, and Murgo's Loft. The bigger reason is that the gameplay within these dungeons is simply not as fun as the base game. When talking about the boss fights, I had mentioned that the context plays a large role in how much fun they are on top of their mechanical polish. These enemies lack the same kind of upfront lore and setup. There's a reason for these enemies being here, and in some cases that lore is really cool, but it isn't often presented well enough to elevate these fights. But that is something I can look past. What I can't look past are some of the design decisions. Let's start with hitboxes. Bloodborne is a very forgiving game when it comes to hitboxes, and I actually think this for most of the Souls game. Not you, Dark Souls 2, not you, but most of them. There were plenty of times I dodged something I probably shouldn't have, but these fights consistently showcase moments where I was hit by something I shouldn't have been hit by, and it made these fights very frustrating. Other fights just had frustrating mechanics, like the Watchdog, who has an AoE move that he performs far too often, punishing my aggression more than rewarding it. Then there are fights that are just normal enemies with a larger health bar, and the problem is that they go down like a normal enemy too. But then, the greatest offense of all is the amygdala. This takes place within a cursed chalice, which means it has one of a few different debuffs applied to the player. In this case, our health is capped. This was a bit of a problem for my build because I basically put all my points into skill and health, but I digress. The dungeon was challenging, but I did notice that most enemies did less damage than normal. I assumed to make sure we weren't completely stomped by it. And yet, the final boss was easily the worst part of the game by far. The final boss is not new, it's just an amygdala, an enemy from the base game. The difference this time is that the fight takes place in an enclosed arena, where we are often struggling to see the boss, and for a fight where spacing is your greatest ally, it feels entirely unfair to take that away from us. This is especially the case when the hitboxes for this fight feel much worse than the base game's fight. When he slams his hands down, the hitbox for this attack lasts so long that it can hit you even after the visual effects are gone, meaning you can't get a hit in at all. I should also mention that because the chalice limits your health, you're often going to be killed in one hit. 2 if you're lucky. It was incredibly frustrating and for all the wrong reasons. I don't want to harp on this too much because it really is a small, entirely optional segment of the game, but I'm really struggling to find issues with Bloodborne, so let me at least have one. Fortunately, what the Chalice dungeons offer is more insight into the base game, specifically in regards to the Pthumerians and Queen Yharnam. She is the final boss of all the Pthumerian chalices, and I think it's an absolutely excellent end, especially when you know the role she played in the base game. Even with the chalice criticisms in mind, I still believe that no other FromSoft game has the same depth in gameplay that Bloodborne does. Sure, other games might have more weapons, enemies, a bigger world, and deeper lore, but nothing comes close to the synergy Bloodborne has between its different facets. Even at the broadest scope, our journey into becoming a great one and rejecting our inherent beasthood is reflected in our ever-increasing skill and ever-increasing knowledge of the game. As we keep ascending, seeing more, lining our brains with the eyes of knowledge, we reflect that very first scene in the game, where a beast is looking to consume us, likely a metaphor for the blood ministration activating a beast within us, but that beasthood is fended off by the messengers, symbols of higher beings. This journey hasn't been specifically discussed yet, and that's mostly because so much of it is left to interpretation, so let's try and set some things straight.
Stay away. Enough blood. Keep it away.
Bloodborne's story is so difficult to talk about because, in many ways, it's not static. I learned a lot through my history degree, and one of the recurring themes was just how much the static events of the past were changing. New information about something even as recent as World War I is always being found, and new interpretations are being found too. The truth is, it's really hard to know anything for sure happened in the past, and for so much, we rely on context clues, first-hand accounts, and many historical interpretations are based entirely around collecting enough evidence that suggests something happened. Then there are those that look at the same set of historical records, photos, accounts, and come to completely different conclusions. I find the same thing happens in Bloodborne and other Souls titles. We find item descriptions, pieces of the environment, different character dialogue, and at times things as abstract as game files to determine what the story is meant to be. When we take those records and interpret the story, in the case of Dark Souls, we often use that evidence to decipher the game's past events, and like history, use it to contextualize our current events. This preamble is necessary because I can't ever speak on Bloodborne's story from a purely factual standpoint. There is never a character that stops you and explains the plot. No item description that says, "This is what happened." We are only granted bits and pieces of the story, and even to this day, my interpretation of events is constantly changing. With that in mind, I invite you to drop your own interpretations and explain what led you there, because to me, that's some of the most fun I've had with this story, seeing what people make of it. But there are some that take issues with the story's delivery, and in my opinion, those criticisms are valid. The truth is, for most players, it would be more convenient to be given at least some direction, some kind of basis to understand the plot, but Bloodborne and most Souls games are not so kind. I have in the past criticized this method of storytelling. I'll paraphrase myself, but essentially my concern was, why do I need to read an item description to hold a basic understanding of the world around me? In more pretentious words, I felt that obscuring so much of the story presented the game as though its story was a grand mystery needing to be uncovered, and it all felt like FromSoft was getting high off their own farts. Now, I would usually apply this to Bloodborne, but I feel this is the one exception, because not only does it offer some kind of direction, but because piecing together the past and not learning everything immediately strengthens the plots and general themes. If the game started by explaining who we are, where we came from, and what the hunt is, then yeah, we would likely appreciate the story more, but it would immediately rip away the pleasure that comes from being continually disillusioned. Bloodborne has answers for many things, and what doesn't have a clear answer always leaves enough detail for theories to crop up. Bloodborne also doesn't concern itself with details that don't totally matter. For example, how does the rest of the world feel about the hunt? What is the rest of the world like? The answer isn't actually told to us, though it is inferred through item descriptions, meaning most players won't know, and it's not important. What is important, the hunt, beasthood, and the Great Ones, are explained well enough directly, be that through cutscenes or NPC dialogue, but there's always enough details to make a second playthrough more tantalizing. The Great Ones that hang on the sides of buildings are always there, but it isn't until the moon enters its second phase that we can actually see them. The story follows a similar suit. We see a white lady with a wound in her stomach more than once, often accompanied by the cries of a child and the cries of the woman, and yet we're never explicitly told what that means. Because of this ambiguity, I'll be doing more recap than is usual on the channel, because as stated, the foundation for my understanding of the story is based on interpretation. So with that said, let's look at what the core story of Bloodborne is, and how it's not simply about killing beasts until the night is over, as Gehrman may wish us to believe. Also, try to remember that, because of the above, I am offering an interpretation of the story, and while I will try to back up the larger claims, don't take this synopsis as an objective timeline, just more of a thoughtful guess. I'll start with the most controversial interpretation, and it's that Bloodborne is more than anything about childbirth and women. The reason this is controversial to some is because it implies a feminist view of the game, and while I don't think the game is necessarily trying to rival Bell Hooks, to deny the inherent femininity of Bloodborne is to deny the basis of the story. The game can't go more than 1 hour without referencing childbirth and newborns, and last I checked, I can't shoot a munchkin out of my penis, so perhaps the women have some involvement in the process. It's implied on more than one occasion that the blood we consume comes from women, specifically during their period. Likely discovered by blind fellatio, this is supported by Ariana's Diva Chalice drying up once she becomes pregnant, no longer being able to minister blood because she's no longer menstruating. Finally, Queen Yharnam is at the forefront of the nightmare, as it's only once her child Mergo is slain that we end the game. Allow me another side tangent. Long before the events of the main game, there was a civilization of Thumerians, tall, pale, powerful people that were driven underground, occupying the Thumerian Chalice dungeons. At the bottom of these dungeons is Yharnam, Thumerian Queen. This is the same figure that shows up when Rom is killed, and once again outside of Mergo's loft. On the night the game takes place, I think Yharnam was either pregnant with a child that was turned into a vessel for Odin's child, another Great One, or her child was lost due to the Great Ones. We see the Great Ones impregnate women across our adventures, specifically with Yosefka and Ariana, both writhing in pain and going mad once the birth is complete. Yharnam is no mere human, however, so I theorize that her baby was the first to meet Odin's standards. Odin is described as a Great One who transcended so high that it no longer has a visible form. We can presume that Odin impregnated Yharnam because she waits outside Mergo's loft, hands clasped like a prayer as if trying to commune with the Great Ones, and once Mergo, an invisible Great One, is killed, we can return to her and see that she is now at peace. Well, why are we killing Mergo then? If Yharnam has a Great One's child, and the Hunter's Dream is created and maintained by a Great One, then why is our goal to kill said Great One? The answer is internal conflict. There are 2 journeys taking place here, one in service of Yharnam and another in service of the Moon Presence. Yharnam's goal is the same as most hunts. There are too many beasts walking about, and we need to call the population until it piles up again. This kind of hunt has taken place many times before, but tonight is different, likely because of the Moon's presence. The Moon Presence is the Great One that resides within the Hunter's Dream and is likely the reason for the exaggerated bestiality, poor choice of words, exaggerated beasthood that takes place during the game. People don't turn into full-on beasts for a while, but tonight, it takes mere hours for someone to go from perfectly healthy to ravenous. Our first encounter against Gascoigne sees him with some scraggly facial hair, but it doesn't take much for him to transform. I believe this is because of the Moon Presence and the moon itself, which might be one and the same. The moon and how much lower it hangs across the night is what is accelerating the transformations. But why? I initially didn't have an answer, but I really like this theory I found on Reddit, which suggests that the Moon Presence creates these beasts that we hunt, gain the blood echoes from, to which the doll transfers to the Moon Presence in exchange for making us stronger, or, by the end of the game, our blood echoes are consumed by the Moon Presence. This would make sense if we applied the Demon Souls power scaling to Bloodborne, wherein the different characters' strength is tied directly to the amount of souls, or in this case blood echoes, they have. What better source of blood echoes, i.e. strength, than from other Great Ones, specifically defenseless ones? This could be why the Moon Presence is initiating the hunt. It wants to get more power and potentially overthrow the other Great Ones, or maybe it has something against Odin. As we progress, we find out more about Yharnam, its healing church, and Yharnam's pursuit of higher beings. For years, Yharnamites had tried to commune with Great Ones, to varying degrees of success. We see how the quest for insight warped the minds of men all over, and I like seeing these different characters go mad because they feel like a glimpse into our future. Gascoigne is what the player becomes if they end up blood drunk during the hunt, succumbing to their beastly instincts. Willem showcases the folly in an obsession with insight, his mind's walls so lined with eyes that he can hardly speak, acting as nothing more than a tool for Rom the Vacuous Spider. Mikolash himself showcases the outcome of being so consumed by dreams and nightmares that they leave their bodies behind. There are many theories behind this, but one I subscribe to, and I apologize because I don't know where this comes from, is that we can see that some of the higher beings have real-world bodies. Rom's head can be found inside Abrides' boss room, implying that when someone or something ascends past the physical realm, they shed their vessels. This could be why Mikolash, in an attempt to enter a nightmare capable of communing with the Great Ones, left the bodies of him and his students behind to rot. Learning of these stories begins to invoke a greater thought that it simply isn't a hunt, and that perhaps there's something more. But with Rom killed, we get to see a world engulfed in chaos, and within that world, we stop hunting beasts and start hunting something bigger. This culminates in Murgo's Loft. As we reach its peak, we encounter the shadows of Yharnam, a boss from the Forbidden Woods that is now here as a regular enemy. I've always liked when games do this. It's a subtle way of showing how far the player has come, and placing these guys right before the final stretch of the game invoked a reflection of the journey, and how much stronger and wiser we are now. And it subtly prepared me to expect something large around the corner. Not the massive hogs that are still most efficiently taken down by shoving your hand up their ass and popping what looks like the world's biggest hemorrhoid, but Murgo, more specifically, her wet nurse. Murgo's wet nurse, like the baby itself, can't be seen. This could be due to its sharing characteristics with Odin, and perhaps the wet nurse and Odin conceived a child together, using Yharnam as a host. Alternatively, this could be due to the wet nurse being of such a high plane that no matter our insight, we cannot comprehend her. Her clothing thankfully can be seen, and it results in one of the hardest boss fights, at times in unfair ways. This was one of the few bosses I wish was retuned a little bit, as Murgo has the ability to spawn a copy, and the problem is when that copy spawns outside of the arena and is able to reach its arms inside and attack you. A minor issue, and truth be told, said lunging attack was avoidable, but keeping vision of the enemy would help a lot. Perhaps the darkness that shrouds our vision is meant to be a metaphor about how these great ones are so beyond comprehension, but the boss being partially invisible already conveys that, so there's no need to impede any further on gameplay. Once the hunt is complete, so is our contract. By this point, the hunter's dream is on fire, and Gehrman reappears under a large tree to tell us that our contract, the one we signed at the beginning of the game, has been fulfilled. At this point, it's clear that the contract we signed at the beginning was to turn us into a hunter, capable of dreaming, as other NPCs refer to it. Not everyone who receives blood becomes a hunter, but it appears that on the night of the hunt, assuming someone is able, they are conscripted to help. Their only way out is to have Gehrman terminate their contract and have them wake up the next day. Some hunters we meet, like Eileen, know of the dream and make specific reference to the doll. It appears some continue to hunt even after the contract is done, but for what reason is unknown. Bloodborne has 3 different endings with completely different implications. You can submit to Gehrman, refuse, and resist. Gehrman explains that once executed by him, you'll wake up the next morning as if everything was a bad dream. This is the option most hunters take. If we look at Eileen as someone who, according to her dialogue, used to dream, we can assume that once she completed her contract, she woke the next day, but kept hunting for her own interests. This is widely seen as the bad ending, mostly because nothing gets solved. There will be another hunt, and you'll likely still be there, as the addicting blood ministration isn't so easy to leave. I consider this to be the worst too, because it signifies a complacency in your adventure. After everything you've seen, everything you've killed, you'd simply pack your things and go? No. Resisting is the least you can do, for 2 reasons. The first is that we have no reason to trust Gehrman. Sure, he has offered the workshop tools to us, including the doll, but all he has told us is to kill some beasts and not think too much about anything. We've been told time and time again that things are not as they seem, and that we might not know everything about the Great Ones. Gehrman is a great hunter, utilizing many of the tools that we too can use, and of course his weapon, the Burial Blade, is one of the most exciting to use in New Game Plus. Once defeated, we're greeted with the Moon Presence who embraces us, consuming most of our power, and tying us to the dream, taking up the same role as Gehrman. Many too would consider this a bad ending, but I don't believe that to be true because in some regard, we have ascended the hunt, and become some kind of higher being. Now, I don't believe we're on the same level as a Great One, but rather somewhere between a Great One and a human. The reason I believe this is because Gehrman shares a characteristic with another more powerful being, specifically Queen Yharnam. Yharnam is a Thumerian, and capable of on 2 occasions casting a projection of herself, in Rom's arena and inside of Murgo's Loft. If attacked, she disappears, much like Gehrman. Now, whether Yharnam disappears or not, she can only be properly killed in the Chalice dungeons deep underground, where her real body is located. This fight too supports the idea that she is projecting copies because it's something she can do in her fight. Gehrman was likely projecting himself too, as when you attack him, he disappears, unless attacked under the Great Tree, and the reason for this difference is that his Great Tree body is his real one. That power, perhaps granted by the Moon Presence, is now transferred to us. But how do we transcend the hunt? By no longer participating. Gehrman is referred to as the first hunter, and was likely the first to strike some kind of accord with the Moon Presence. We know other hunters have dreamed previously, so it's likely that Gehrman was there too, as the doll is referenced, which was created by Gehrman. This means he likely survived many hunts as more of a coach than anything, only picking up his scythe for hunters whose contracts have been fulfilled. Whether you believe this is a life of servitude or peace is up to you, though I lean more to the former. Finally, the last ending sees us embracing the Moon Presence again, but this time being able to break free of its grasp. thanks to our gained insight. There are 4/3 of an umbilical cord, likely of unborn Great Ones that we can obtain, and consuming 3 will allow us to resist. Part of consuming the umbilical cords is to gain the insight from them, mechanically, and line our brain with eyes. But the other reason is to understand the hunt. We obtain our umbilical cords from Yosefka once she is impregnated with a Great One, Ariana once she gives birth to a Great One, Murgo once she is hunted, and finally, from the abandoned workshop. All of these symbolize massive insights into the Great Ones. We comprehend the workshop, clearly the setting for the hunter's dream, likely where Gamron first carried out his hunts. We learn of how a Great One loses its child, and how it searches for a surrogate mother in women like Yosefka, and how that child is born with Ariana. We see the stages of birth, and most importantly, we see that the Great Ones aren't always hostile. During our journey, we can enter the top of Cathedral Ward, a location that seems as though it lives in the cosmos, and up there we can find tons of little Great Ones, and even Abritus, daughter of the cosmos. She and the little ones are not hostile until provoked. It makes us wonder if the Great Ones were ever hostile at all. Surely they must be if the moon presence is accelerating the curse of blood ministration and forcing people to hunt their own, and of course, impregnating the women of Yharnam too is a hostile endeavor. But still, something tells me the Great Ones might be mostly reacting to what the humans have done to them. It is only once this has been comprehended, further explained by the item descriptions, that we can challenge the moon presence. I believe this is why you need to consume the umbilical cords, as there's a higher chance, once in the inventory, that you'll take a look at the item's descriptions, which reveal even more. This final ending sees us transforming into a Great One, but it never explains how. However, I believe there are some theories we can rule out. This new Great One is us, as confirmed by the doll, but has nothing to do with Odin, because if it did, we would likely be formless. Our form is of a slug with tentacles, something unlike the moon presence, so I don't imagine we are a kind of offspring from them. I think the most likely theory is that after gaining so much insight, bathing in so much pale blood, we have truly ascended past our human form, having it left behind as we enter this new body. The final ending is also the only one where the hunt likely ends, as the moon presence is dead, unless the good hunter, now having more insight, understands what the moon presence was doing, and now wants to continue the ritual. This could perhaps be the case, as we are born anew within the dream, and someone or something must be keeping it alive, after the creature that created it died. Each ending begins the next playthrough immediately. I would have enjoyed an option to start the next playthrough at the Hunter's Dream, especially when the Chalice dungeons offer a lot of post-game value if you enjoy them, and considering that Bloodborne received one expansion titled The Old Hunters, which could potentially force players to replay the game from the beginning to experience it. Overall, Bloodborne's story is confusing, not in a negative way, as its cryptic nature is certainly intentional and reflective of a larger theme of insight and comprehension. With that said, I wish it were a bit easier to piece together some kind of timeline of events. In spite of the details presented to the player, and even a few notes that directly explain what has happened, whenever a game is so confusing that many players that I've spoken to, including myself on my first playthrough, didn't understand what was going on, it makes me question if we're sacrificing comprehension in favor of a deeper story, and if that's a good choice. To again present an anecdote, Bloodborne's story, specifically aided by the environmental design, is so well made that in spite of not entirely understanding what was happening, it was fun hunting beasts, especially when they progressively become more and more Lovecraftian. Sometimes it's fun to be completely out of your depth, and while it might frustrate some players, it's equally valid to feel entirely disconnected. Simply walking through the different locales, hearing words but not understanding them, and bludgeoning anything with a health bar, maybe that's the beasthood we're meant to eventually get away from, in search of more insight, and really open our eyes.
A corpse should be left well alone.
The Old Hunters is widely considered to be one of the best DLCs in FromSoft's catalog, though this is the case for most of their DLCs, because they are all of a high quality, except for one that I won't name in fear of being hung in the town square. The Old Hunters, however, is very different from the base game, both in terms of enemies, design, and of course, the story. Unlike the rest of the game, a majority of the Old Hunters is easy to understand, and most characters will flat out tell you what's happening. To me, this doesn't undercut the value of the story, and in fact, it enhances the base game as the base game enhances the DLC. If you understood the story of Bloodborne, then the Old Hunters will add significantly more knowledge, and further answer some questions you had. If you didn't quite get it, by the end of the Old Hunters, you probably will. Hell, there's a recurring character that actually gives you exposition, something very out of place in a FromSoft game. In this case, we get confirmation that the Healing Church and the rest of Yharnam and its hunters past wasn't as squeaky clean as my optimism had hoped. We see how they have defiled their own kind, hidden their exploits, and how perhaps the curse that seems to hang over Yharnam isn't entirely undeserved. The gameplay isn't very different, and its level design is significantly more varied in some great ways. We transition between day, night, and rain on the drop of a dime, and our enemies are as tough as ever. In line with FromSoft, the dogs are abysmal, but the new hunters are a welcome change of pace compared to the base game. It's said that the hunters who become blood drunk end up in the hunter's nightmare, leading me to assume that, had we not put Gascoigne out of his misery, then perhaps he would have ended up here too. The end of the Nightmare's entrance is marked with Ludwig, a character we heard so much about in the base game, and has an excellent fight here. It's a shame that this fight is so good, because it showcases how much better the boss fights in this game could have been had they just zoomed the camera out a bit. Ludwig, for some reason, is one of the only fights against a large enemy that isn't a complete pain, because all of his attacks, even if fast, are well telegraphed, and it was extremely uncommon for me to feel like I couldn't see during the fight. I'm also going to be honest, while I think the Moonlight Greatsword is cool, it never struck me as this insanely significant item, and in spite of that, the second phase cutscene was pretty great. After Ludwig is dispatched, we move to the Astral Clock Tower, which is a masterclass in body horror and general unease. The higher we ascend the tower, the crazier it all gets, with these test subjects calling out for Lady Maria. We can even find some that are so horribly disfigured that they are simply pieces of sludge on the ground. Their dialogue sounds insane, and if killed, they will drop brain fluid, which we can give to one of the test subjects, and we'll see her writhe in its pleasure like it's some kind of high, eventually incorporating their dialogue into her own. It's all incredibly gross and indicative of how horrific the actions of this Lady Maria are. This is capped off with a fight against the Living Failures, which as a boss is rather bland, but it did invoke a thought of what these experiments were in search of. The Living Failures are just like a lot of the Celestials we find, and their likeness to the experiments within the laboratory reframed how I saw Yosefka's research. She is not the first to do these experiments. Was she influenced by what she found here? Is the Hunter's Nightmare like the dream based on a real location where these events occurred? Was Yosefka involved? We're not sure, but beyond the Living Failures is the peak of the Astral Clock Tower, and the best boss in Bloodborne. Lady Maria's introduction, design, moveset, and everything else surrounding her is genuine perfection. I have basically no criticisms. Even her short lines of dialogue speak volumes for the rest of the DLC. A lot of the old hunters revolves around a secret that the hunters are hiding, and Maria herself hides the entrance to that very secret, and a warning they should have heeded. A corpse should be left well alone. Because she's an insane threat, but the hunters too should have done that, for they wouldn't be in this nightmare if a corpse was left well alone. She rides the line perfectly on being tough but fair, and is some of the best boss design I've seen, while also maintaining some incredible phase transitions and easily the best outfit in the game. Even the lore implications of Maria as being one of the first hunters who studied under Gehrman, being the basis for the doll he would become uncomfortably obsessed with. Truly, I could not gush about this enough. What Maria hides is just as beautiful though, as when the clock tower opens, we are greeted with the fishing hamlet. The fishing hamlet is the closest an environment gets to being in a stage of grief. The sky is constantly crying, the sun itself resembling an eye bloodshot from the tears, and its inhabitants endlessly curse those who defiled the Great Ones. Once again, we are given direct exposition. We did something to Kos, a great one that supposedly cursed this land and created the nightmare. The hamlet is full of tough enemies and we're constantly invaded by someone. This appears to be someone we meet earlier, who asks us if we hear a bell, of course referring to the bell that tolls when he enters our world. He even takes out our friend that has been guiding us through most of the journey, and we can get our revenge, which was a pretty interesting side quest. But at the end of it all is Kos. Nothing more than a corpse washed ashore, but as the camera pans over, Kos's child crawls out of their womb, cries at the sun, and gets ready to attack. The Orphan of Kos is widely considered to be the hardest boss in the game, and for good reason. Their attacks come out fast, hit like a freight train, and the aggression rarely lets up. The largest gaps for damage don't come in the form of time between attacks, but instead in the time between dodges. Truly, this is another pinnacle of boss design and is all around fantastic. My only complaint is that the lightning attack is pretty hard to dodge, but that particular attack never did too much damage, so I don't mind. Once Koss is defeated, likely after 5 hours, their ghost can be seen staring at the sun, and we have a choice to let the orphan come back, repeat the cycle, let the greed of the church be punished forever, or we can end it, slaying another nightmare. After all, a corpse should be left well alone. I think a large reason the Old Hunters is viewed so fondly is because it's a constant stream of Bloodborne at its best and most digestible. It's very easy to understand, and the bosses are all great, back to back to back. Sure, the living failures are a weak spot, but it's such an easy fight that most players will likely have steamrolled through it. And of course, everything from Lady Maria until the end of the expansion is top notch. It's rare that a DLC so greatly expands on what this game does so well, and had this video been made a few years ago, there would have been a whole separate video claiming that this DLC is DLC done right. It adds some new great bosses, weapons, attire, locations, and serves only to enhance the base game. I didn't play this DLC until 9 years after the game released, and I really wish I had played it sooner. If Bloodborne ever gets ported to PC, not including the Old Hunters, would be a crime against the game. Bloodborne as a product is more than worth its price tag, no question, but Bloodborne as a piece of art is worth its weight in gold. A poor analogy given that the disc weighs 1/10 of a pound, but you get the point. Even the vibes alone, assuming you don't care to look at anything in the game deeper, it presents an expert recreation of Lovecraftian horror. Everything from its level design that breaks metaphysical constraints, to the winter lanterns, whose all-seeing eyes and haunting singing still send shivers down my spine. Furthermore, the lack of knowledge the game uses as a basis for progression and storytelling makes this the first time where FromSoft's refusal to tell the players anything actually works in the game's favor. I wish I could have spoken more about the lore and story. My writing was constantly torn between wanting to just ramble about how cool the lore is and all the fun details I have observed through the game or learned through the different lore videos on YouTube. I had to make the call to keep the story and lore summarizing to a minimum, and besides, I don't have the deep European voice required for lore videos. This video instead focused on the assumption that you know the general events, and I offered my own interpretation, but I beg you, if you are interested in learning more, jump down that rabbit hole. It's unforgettable. What further cements Bloodborne's story as being one of the best is its ability to weave its environment and gameplay into a cohesive journey. It's one thing to make a game with combat, story, and a setting, but to have those things come together to form a greater message is a much harder task. Even with that in mind, Bloodborne's individual assets succeed. Environmental design is top-notch all over the game to the point where it doesn't need to be analyzed. Just use your eyes! Gameplay-wise, it follows suit of FromSoft games being challenging, but it never became unfair, aside from one instance. Everything from the trick weapons to the hunter tools leaves Bloodborne being a game with endless replayability. The greatest testament to Bloodborne's legacy is simply the community. Every year, players get together to do a playthrough again, keeping the online community alive. I'm still part of the subreddit where I see people reacting to the game for the first time, or posting exceptional fan art. Communities like that don't crop up often, especially not ones that last for an entire decade. There's simply nothing else like Bloodborne. And while I've given most of my thoughts here, I truly feel as though I have only scratched the surface of how great this game is, and how much I love it. If for some reason you haven't played Bloodborne yet, then do yourself the favor. It's playable on PlayStation 4 and 5 and can be emulated if you know where to look. If you aren't convinced to play it, then there's nothing I can do for you. As for the people who have played it and enjoyed it, thank you for keeping the community alive. And while I'm sure it's a little annoying by this point, I really do hope we get a port sometime soon, because Bloodborne truly is a great one.